Jacob Morrison stood at the edge of his property line, watching smoke rise from the Lakota settlement in the distance. The government surveyors had been through 3 times in the past month, their measuring chains and transit instruments mapping every acre of the Thunder Ridge territory. His ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of prime grazing land, but those smoke columns reminded him that his prosperity sat on ground that others had called home for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of burning sage and something else changed. Jacob pulled his coat tighter against the mountain air. At 32, he had built everything from nothing. Carved a life from wilderness, raised cattle where buffalo once roamed, transformed raw land into something that fed half the territory. But lately, success felt hollow. The ranch house echoed with emptiness. Meals eaten alone. Conversations limited to ranch hands and cattle buyers. His sister Catherine had written from St. Louis 3 months ago, her letter filled with gentle suggestions about marriage and companionship. She had even included advertisements from Eastern newspapers, women seeking husbands, men seeking wives, the practical arrangements that built families on the frontier. Jacob had dismissed the idea then. Now, watching the distant smoke dissipate into the gray sky, loneliness pressed against him like the approaching winter. The sound of horses approaching broke his contemplation. 3 riders emerged from the timber government men by their dress and bearing. The lead rider wore a territorial badge that caught the afternoon sun. Jacob recognized him. Thomas Brennan, Territorial Land Commissioner, a man whose decisions could reshape entire counties. "Morrison," Brennan called as they approached. "Beautiful piece of land you have here." "Thank you." Jacob remained mounted, reading the tension in their posture. "What brings you out this way?" Brennan gestured toward the Lakota settlement. "Official business. The territorial government has reached an agreement with the tribal council. Voluntary relocation to the reservation. Compensation for improvements made to the land, voluntary." Jacob tested the word like something bitter. "And if they refuse?" "The railroad needs this corridor for the northern route. Progress requires difficult decisions sometimes." Brennan's voice carried the weight of inevitability. "The tribe has 60 days to relocate. After that, federal marshals will escort them to their new home." Jacob's jaw tightened. He had traded with the Lakota for years, bought horses from their herds, shared information about weather and game movements. They were neighbors in the truest sense, bound by respect rather than law. 60 days to abandon everything they've ever known. They're receiving fair compensation. New land on the reservation. Government supplies for the first year. Brennan leaned forward in his saddle. "This affects you too, Morrison. Once the tribe relocates, their traditional hunting grounds become available for homestead claims. 20,000 acres of prime valley land." The implication struck Jacob immediately. 20,000 acres adjacent to his current holdings would create an empire. Control over the entire Thunder Ridge Valley, water rights to 3 major streams, grazing land that could support thousands of head of cattle. The kind of opportunity that came once in a lifetime. What's the process? The words escaped before he could stop them. File a claim with the territorial office. Prove improvements within 2 years. Standard homestead requirements, but given your established presence here, approval would be routine. Brennan smiled, sensing the opportunity. A man with your resources could transform this entire region. After the officials departed, Jacob rode through his existing ranch, seeing it with new eyes. The pastures stretched toward distant mountains, his cattle scattered across rolling hills like dark dots on green canvas. The barn complex spoke of prosperity, well-built structures that would stand for generations. The main house sat solidly in a grove of cottonwoods, its windows reflecting afternoon light. But as he crested the ridge overlooking the Lakota settlement, guilt gnawed at his conscience. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played between the lodges. Women worked at various tasks while men tended horses in carefully constructed corrals. This was not a temporary camp, but a permanent community, roots grown deep over generations. Jacob had heard the stories from tribal elders during trading sessions. Their ancestors had wintered in this valley for centuries before the first white settlers arrived. Sacred sites dotted the landscape, burial grounds, vision quest locations, places where spiritual significance transcended legal ownership. The government's voluntary relocation, with severe connections that predated any territorial charter. Evening found Jacob in his study, surrounded by ranch ledgers and maps. The numbers told a compelling story. His current operation ran 2,000 head of cattle across 12,000 acres. With access to the additional valley land, he could triple his herd, establish breeding programs that would supply ranchers across 3 territories. The financial projections staggered him wealth beyond his current ambitions, security for generations of Morrisons yet to come. But wealth built on displacement left a bitter taste. Jacob poured himself whiskey and stared out the window toward the settlement. Firelight flickered between the lodges. Somewhere in that glow, families made plans for an uncertain future, weighing the government's promises against the reality of starting over in an unfamiliar place. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Marcus Sullivan, his foreman, entered with a concerned expression. Marcus had worked the ranch for 8 years, knew every cow and every acre, understood the operation better than anyone. "Boss, got word from town. Railroad surveyors will be through next week, mapping the exact route through the valley." Marcus settled into the chair across from Jacob's desk. "Tommy Peterson at the general store says they're planning a depot about 5 miles east of the settlement. That close?" Jacob set down his whiskey glass. "Gets better. Or worse, depending on how you look at it." Peterson heard tell of a cattle loading facility. Permanent structures, year-round operation. Marcus leaned back in his chair. The kind of development that brings more than just trains. Jacob understood the implications. Railroads brought commerce, and commerce brought people. Towns sprouted around depots like mushrooms after rain. What was now open rangeland would soon host buildings, streets, all the infrastructure of civilization. The Lakota settlement stood directly in the path of this progress. "There's something else," Marcus continued. Peterson mentioned advertisements. In the eastern papers, railroad companies recruiting settlers for the new town site, offering land grants, building supplies, even arranging transportation for families willing to relocate. The territorial government's 60-day deadline suddenly made perfect sense. Remove the tribal presence before the railroad arrived. Clear the way for development that would generate taxes and political support. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. "What do you think we should do?" Jacob asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. "From a business standpoint, acquiring that valley land would set us up for life. Triple our operation, control the water rights, position ourselves for the railroad trade." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "From a human standpoint, it feels like profiting from other people's misery." Before Jacob could respond, rapid hoofbeats approached the house. Through the window, they saw a young Lakota rider dismounting quickly, his horse lathered from hard travel. Jacob recognized him. Running Wolf, son of Chief Standing Bear, a young man who often translated during trading sessions. Jacob opened the door before Running Wolf could knock. The young man's face showed urgency mixed with desperation. "Mr. Morrison, I must speak with you. It concerns my sister. Come in." Jacob gestured toward the study. "Marcus, pour our guest some coffee." Running Wolf accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands wrapped around the warm cup. "The government men spoke with our council today. They demand we leave our home, relocate to the reservation." His English carried only the slightest accent, evidence of education that defied stereotypes. "My father wishes to negotiate, but the territorial commissioner says the decision is final." "I'm sorry," Jacob said sincerely. 60 days is not enough time to plan such a move. It is not meant to be enough time. Running Wolf's voice hardened. "They want us to fail, to leave everything behind so they can claim we abandoned the land, rather than being forced from it." The political maneuvering made sense from a legal standpoint. Abandonment simplified property transfers, eliminated potential future claims, provided clean titles for new settlers. The government could present the relocation as voluntary cooperation rather than forced displacement. "You mentioned your sister," Marcus prompted gently. Running Wolf set down his coffee cup. "Ayanna is the last of our bloodline to carry the old knowledge. She knows the sacred sites, the seasonal ceremonies, the healing plants that grow only in this valley. When our people are gone, that knowledge dies with distance." Jacob waited, sensing more to the story. She has decided to stay. Not to fight the government, but to preserve what she can. To find a way to remain connected to this land even as our people are forced to leave it. Running Wolf looked directly at Jacob. She has heard of white marriages arranged through letters. Women who travel west to marry men they have never met. The implication struck Jacob like lightning. She wants to become a mail-order bride. She wants to marry someone who will respect her connection to this land. Someone who understands that she cannot be taken from here without destroying something precious. Running Wolf's eyes held desperate hope. "I have heard you are an honorable man, that you trade fairly, speak truthfully. My sister believes a marriage arrangement might allow her to stay in the valley even as our people are relocated." Jacob stared at the young man, his mind racing through implications. Marrying a Lakota woman would certainly complicate his own claim to the tribal lands. The government would likely view such a union as suspect, possibly fraudulent. His standing in the territorial community would face scrutiny. Some neighbors would approve. Others would condemn the arrangement as either progressive thinking or opportunistic manipulation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But Ayanna's situation touched something deeper than social calculation. The idea of preserving knowledge, maintaining connections to sacred places, honoring traditions that predated territorial governments. These motivations spoke to principles Jacob respected. "Tell me about your sister," he said finally. Running Wolf's face brightened with relief. "Ayanna is 24 winters old. She has studied with our medicine woman since childhood, learned to read the land, to understand the seasonal cycles that govern life in this valley. She speaks English well, learned from the missionary school before she understood what they truly wanted from our people." What did they want? To replace our knowledge with their knowledge. To convince us that our ways were wrong, primitive, unsuited for the modern world. Running Wolf's voice carried old anger. "Ayanna learned their language but kept our wisdom. She can move between both worlds without losing herself in either." Jacob found himself curious about this woman who would sacrifice her tribal connections to preserve tribal knowledge. The contradictions intrigued him. Educated, but traditional. Willing to marry a stranger, but determined to maintain her cultural identity. How would this work practically? Marcus asked. "I mean, the legal arrangements, the community reactions, the ... The complications," Jacob finished. "Yes, there would be many." Running Wolf nodded solemnly. "Ayanna understands the difficulties. She is prepared to face whatever challenges come. But she believes that preserving her connection to this land matters more than maintaining social comfort." The conversation continued late into the evening. Running Wolf described the tribal council's debates, the government's increasingly urgent demands, the railroad's aggressive timeline for construction. He painted a picture of a community under siege, forced to make impossible choices between preservation and survival. As midnight approached, Jacob made a decision that surprised him. With its certainty. "Arrange a meeting," he said. "I want to speak with Ayanna directly. No commitments yet, but I'm willing to explore the possibility." Running Wolf's smile transformed his entire demeanor. "She hoped you would say that. Tomorrow at the old trading post by Willow Creek. She will be there at sunset." After Running Wolf departed, Jacob and Marcus sat in contemplative silence. The fire burned low in the study fireplace, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Outside, the mountain wind whistled through the cottonwoods. "You realize what you're considering," Marcus said finally. "I'm considering a lot of things. Marriage to a woman I've never met. Complicating my land acquisition opportunities. Challenging territorial policies that could affect my business relationships." Jacob stared into the dying fire. "I'm also considering whether there's more to life than accumulating acres and counting cattle." Marcus nodded slowly. "Your sister, Catherine, would approve. She's been after you to find a wife for years. Catherine wants me to be happy. I'm not sure happiness and expanding the ranch are the same thing anymore." Jacob stood, fatigue weighing on his shoulders. "Maybe it's time to find out what I actually want instead of just pursuing what I'm supposed to want." The next evening, Jacob rode toward Willow Creek through golden autumn light. The trading post sat abandoned, its log walls weathered gray, its roof sagging from seasons of neglect. The structure had once served as neutral ground where tribal members and white settlers conducted business, but changing times had rendered such meeting places obsolete. As he approached, Jacob saw a figure waiting in the shadows of the building. She stepped into the light as he dismounted, and Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Ayanna carried herself with quiet dignity, her dark hair braided with traditional beads that caught the fading sunlight. She wore a simple dress that blended tribal craftsmanship with frontier practicality, beautiful in its understated elegance. But it was her eyes that struck Jacob most forcefully, intelligent, determined, touched with sadness, but unbroken by circumstances. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice soft but clear, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Miss ... Jacob paused, realizing he didn't know how to address her properly. "Ayanna will suffice. Among my people, names carry power. I offer mine freely to someone who might understand its value." They walked along the creek bank as shadows lengthened. Ayanna spoke of her childhood in the valley, learning to identify medicinal plants from her grandmother, participating in ceremonies that marked the changing seasons, understanding the spiritual geography that made this place sacred to her people. "Government sees empty land waiting for development," she said, picking up a smooth stone from the creek bed. "We see the place where our ancestors' spirits dwell, where seasonal ceremonies maintain the balance between human needs and natural order. When they relocate us to the reservation, they break connections that have existed for centuries." Jacob listened, beginning to understand the depth of what would be lost. "And you believe staying here as my wife would preserve those connections?" "I believe it would preserve the possibility of preserving them. My children could learn the old ways even if they grow up in a changing world. The sacred sites would have someone to tend them even if official ceremonies are forbidden." Ayanna looked directly at him. "I am offering to bridge two worlds, Mr. Morrison. The question is whether you want to be part of that bridge." The proposal challenged everything Jacob had planned for his future. Marriage to Ayanna would mean abandoning his claim to the tribal lands, accepting a wife whose presence would complicate his social standing, taking responsibility for preserving knowledge he barely understood, but it would also mean companionship with someone whose depth exceeded anything he had encountered, partnership with a woman who valued principles over profit, the chance to build something meaningful rather than merely successful. As the sun set behind the mountains, Jacob made another decision that surprised him. "Yes," he said simply, "I want to be part of that bridge." Ayana's smile carried the weight of gratitude and hope in equal measure. Then we have much to plan and little time to plan it. The marriage ceremony took place at dawn, 3 days before the government's relocation deadline. Father Miguel Hernandez, the traveling priest who served scattered settlements throughout the territory, had arrived the previous evening with questions in his eyes and compassion in his heart. He had married desperate couples before unions, born of necessity rather than romance, but something about Jacob and Ayana's arrangement felt different. "Are you certain this is what you both want?" Father Hernandez asked as they stood beneath the cottonwoods behind Jacob's ranch house. The morning air carried the scent of frost and possibility. "We are certain of our commitment to each other and to this land," Ayana replied, her wedding dress a careful blend of white cotton and traditional beadwork. Her grandmother had worked through the night to complete the intricate patterns that honored both cultures. Jacob wore his best suit, the one reserved for cattle buyers and territorial meetings. But his hands shook slightly as he took Ayana's fingers on his own. Not from nervousness about the ceremony, but from the magnitude of what they were undertaking together. The vows they spoke were traditional words layered with extraordinary meaning. When Jacob promised to honor and protect his wife, he committed to defending her right to remain connected to sacred places. When Ayana promised to love and support her husband, she pledged to help him understand the spiritual significance of the land he called home. Running Wolf served as witness, his presence a bridge between the world his sister was leaving and the one she was entering. Marcus stood beside Jacob, his weathered face showing approval mixed with concern. The ceremony concluded with a blessing that acknowledged both Christian tradition and Lakota spiritual customs. "By the authority vested in me by the territorial government and by God's grace, I pronounce you husband and wife," Father Hernandez said. "May your union bring understanding between peoples and peace to this valley." The kiss that sealed their marriage tasted of morning dew and uncharted futures. 2 hours later, territorial marshals arrived at the Lakota settlement with wagons and official papers. Jacob and Ayana watched from the ridge as families loaded their possessions, children clinging to mothers, elders taking final looks at the place that had sheltered their ancestors. The relocation proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency that made the heartbreak feel routine. Chief Standing Bear approached Jacob and Ayana as the wagons prepared to depart. The old chief's face bore the weight of generations, his eyes holding wisdom earned through decades of navigating impossible circumstances. "You have chosen a difficult path," he said to Jacob. "My daughter carries the memory of our people. That is a sacred trust." "I understand the responsibility," Jacob replied. "Do you?" Standing Bear's gaze intensified. "The knowledge she preserves is not a decoration for your new life together. It is a living tradition that requires constant tending. It will ask things of you that no other marriage would demand." Ayana stepped forward, placing her hand on her father's arm. "He has already proven his willingness to sacrifice profit for principle. That gives me hope." Standing Bear nodded slowly, then removed a leather pouch from around his neck. Inside, Jacob glimpsed what appeared to be seeds, dried roots, and small stones. The medicine bundle contains plant seeds that grow only in this valley. Some are for healing, others for ceremony. Guard them well. One day, our people may return to plant them again. The weight of the pouch in Jacob's hands felt heavier than gold. He was now custodian of botanical knowledge that connected past and future, keeper of genetic material that might someday restore what was being lost. As the wagon train disappeared into the eastern distance, Ayana stood perfectly still, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. Jacob resisted the urge to comfort her immediately, sensing that this grief required space to breathe. When she finally turned toward him, her expression had transformed into something resembling peace. "Now we begin the real work," she said. The first challenge came within hours. Wade Thompson, who owned the neighboring ranch to the south, arrived with two of his hands and an expression that promised trouble. Thompson had been vocal in his support for tribal relocation, seeing it as long overdue progress that would benefit all white settlers in the region. "Morrison," Thompson called from horseback, his voice carrying across the ranch yard. "Heard you took yourself to an Indian wife." Jacob emerged from the barn where he had been checking harness leather. "News travels fast enough. Question is whether you've lost your mind or just found a clever way to claim tribal land rights." Thompson dismounted, his hands resting on his gun belt in a gesture meant to intimidate. "My marriage has nothing to do with land claims." "Doesn't it?" Thompson's smile held no warmth. "Awful convenient timing. Tribe gets relocated. You marry one of their women. Suddenly you've got connections to argue for special consideration." Ayanna appeared in the ranch house doorway, drawn by the sound of raised voices. Her presence changed the atmosphere immediately. Tension crackling like electricity before a storm. "That her?" Thompson's gaze moved over Ayanna with casual disrespect. "Pretty enough, I suppose. But marrying into a dying people seems like poor planning." Jacob stepped forward, his own hand moving toward his sidearm. "You'll show my wife respect or you'll leave my property. Easy, Morrison. No need for threats." Between neighbors. Thompson raised his hands in mock surrender. "Just wanted to offer some friendly advice. The territorial government won't look kindly on marriages that complicate their relocation efforts. Might even decide such unions are fraudulent, designed to circumvent federal policy." The warning carried legal weight. Marriage fraud was a federal offense, and territorial courts had broad discretion in determining what constituted legitimate versus opportunistic unions. A prosecutor could argue that Jacob's marriage to Ayanna was a scheme to claim tribal lands or interfere with government relocation efforts. "Our marriage is legal and legitimate," Jacob said firmly. "Witnessed by a priest and recorded with the territorial clerk. Legal and wise are different things." Thompson remounted his horse. "Think carefully about what you're really choosing here. A man's reputation is hard to rebuild once it's damaged." After Thompson departed, Jacob found Ayanna sitting on the porch steps, her hands folded in her lap. Her composure never wavered, but he sensed the effort required to maintain such dignity in the face of hostility. "This is what I expected," she said quietly. "What we will face every day from some people." Jacob sat beside her on the steps. "Are you having second thoughts?" "Are you?" She looked at him directly. "I knew the challenges when I accepted your proposal. The question is whether you truly understood what you were taking on." Before Jacob could answer, another rider approached from the east. This one carried himself with military bearing, his uniform identifying him as cavalry rather than territorial marshal. Captain James Hartford dismounted crisply and approached with official authority. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Captain Hartford, stationed at Fort Collins. I need to speak with you about your recent marriage." Jacob's heart sank. Federal intervention had come even faster than Thompson had predicted. "What about my marriage?" "The territorial governor has received reports suggesting your union with a tribal member may be connected to land fraud. I'm here to investigate those allegations." Hartford's tone remained professional but firm. "There is no fraud. My wife and I married legally and in good faith. That remains to be determined." Hartford produced a folded document. "This is a federal warrant authorizing investigation into potential violations of territorial settlement law. I'll need to examine your marriage certificate, interview both parties separately, and review any correspondence related to the arrangement." Ayanna stood slowly, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. "Captain Hartford, I am Ayanna Morrison. I entered this marriage willingly and with full understanding of its implications. No fraud has occurred." Hartford studied her carefully. "You speak English very well for someone who lived in a tribal settlement. Education is not exclusive to white communities, Captain. I learned English to better understand the world my people must navigate. And you believe marriage to Mr. Morrison serves that navigation? The question carried multiple layers of meaning. Hartford was probing whether Ayanna saw the marriage as genuine partnership or opportunistic arrangement. I believe marriage to Mr. Morrison allows me to preserve knowledge that would otherwise be lost while building a life that honors both my heritage and my future. Ayanna's answer was both truthful and carefully crafted. Hartford spent the afternoon conducting interviews, examining documents, and touring the ranch. His questions revealed the government's real concerns: whether Jacob's marriage was designed to interfere with tribal relocation, claim disputed lands, or establish legal precedents that might complicate future federal policies. As evening approached, Hartford delivered his preliminary findings. I find no evidence of intentional fraud, he announced. However, the timing and circumstances of your marriage raise legitimate questions about motivation. I'm recommending continued federal monitoring of your situation. What does that mean? Practically, Jacob asked. Monthly reports on your activities. Periodic interviews with both parties. Documentation of any land claims or legal actions involving tribal territories. Hartford's expression softened slightly. Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison, I understand you believe your intentions are honorable, but the federal government has invested considerable resources in peaceful tribal relocation. Any actions that appear to undermine those efforts will be viewed seriously. After Hartford departed, Jacob and Ayanna sat on the porch watching stars emerge overhead. The weight of federal scrutiny added new complexity to their already challenging situation. Monthly reports, Ayanna mused. They want to ensure I'm truly adapting to white society, that our marriage isn't a cover for continued tribal activities. Will that be difficult? She considered the question carefully. It depends on how we define adaptation. I can learn to cook your food, wear your clothes, speak only English when officials are present, but the sacred sites still need tending. The seasonal ceremonies still require observance. The plant medicines still need harvesting. Jacob began to understand the delicate balance Ayanna would need to maintain. She would have to appear sufficiently assimilated to satisfy federal monitors, while secretly preserving tribal traditions that such assimilation was designed to eliminate. How do we manage both? Very carefully, and with complete trust in each other. Ayanna looked at him in the starlight. There can be no secrets between us about what I'm doing or why. If the government discovers I'm maintaining tribal practices, they must believe you were unaware of them. The conversation revealed another layer of sacrifice Ayanna was making. Not only was she giving up her tribal community, she was accepting that preserving her culture might require deceiving her husband in the eyes of federal authorities. I won't pretend ignorance about your activities, Jacob said firmly. If you're taking risks to preserve your traditions, I want to know about them. We face whatever consequences come together. Ayanna's smile carried gratitude and relief. That is what I hoped you would say. Over the following weeks, they developed routines that served multiple purposes. Ayanna learned ranch management with genuine enthusiasm, her understanding of seasonal cycles and animal behavior proving invaluable for cattle operations. But her real education involved identifying which federal officials could be trusted, which neighbors might report suspicious activities, and which times of day offered privacy for traditional practices. The sacred sites scattered throughout the valley required careful attention. Each location had specific seasonal requirements, ceremonies to mark solstices, plant harvests that coincided with lunar cycles, offerings that maintained spiritual balance between human activity and natural order. Ayanna had to continue these practices without attracting attention from federal monitors or hostile neighbors. She developed cover stories that blended truth with misdirection. Collecting medicinal plants became gathering herbs for cooking. Visiting burial sites became taking walks to enjoy scenery. Performing seasonal ceremonies became private meditation time. The deceptions felt uncomfortable but necessary for preservation. Jacob learned to recognize the subtle signs of Ayana's cultural activities. When she needed to visit sacred sites, she would mention checking water sources in the north pasture. When seasonal ceremonies required specific timing, she would suggest early morning rides to watch sunrise over the mountains. Their communication developed layers of meaning that satisfied both marital honesty and operational security. The first major test came during the autumn equinox. Ayana explained that tribal tradition required a ceremony at the valley's highest sacred site, a process that involved overnight solitude and ritual activities that would be impossible to explain if discovered. The ceremony marks the balance between summer and winter, the time when spirits of the ancestors offer guidance for the coming season, she explained. Missing it would break a chain of observance that extends back generations. Jacob understood the importance, but worried about the risks. Captain Hartford's men patrol regularly. If they find you alone at night in the mountains, they will find a woman who lost her way coming back from visiting her husband's cattle. A new bride is still learning the boundaries of ranch land. Ayana's explanation was plausible but dangerous. I'm coming with you. You cannot. The ceremony requires solitude, and your presence would change its spiritual meaning. Ayana touched his arm gently. This is one burden I must carry alone. Jacob spent a sleepless night worrying while Ayana performed ceremonies he could never fully understand. When she returned at dawn, her face showed the peace that came from fulfilling sacred obligations despite tremendous risk. The ancestors are pleased that the traditions continue, she said simply. They understand the sacrifices required, and they approve of our marriage. The federal monitor's first monthly visit came 2 weeks later. Lieutenant Thomas Bradley arrived with notebooks and prepared questions, determined to document Ayana's progress toward assimilation and Jacob's activities regarding tribal land. Mrs. Morrison, Bradley began formally. How are you adapting to life as a rancher's wife? Very well, Lieutenant. My husband has been patient in teaching me ranch operations, and I find the work satisfying. Ayana's answers were truthful but carefully incomplete. Do you maintain contact with members of your former tribal community? The reservation is many days' travel from here. Communication is difficult. Again, truthful but misleading. Have you or your husband made any claims to lands formerly occupied by tribal members? We have not filed any land claims beyond my husband's existing ranch boundaries. This answer satisfied legal requirements while avoiding discussion of spiritual connections to sacred sites. Bradley's questions continued for over an hour, probing for evidence of fraud, tribal communication, or land manipulation. Jacob and Ayana's answers remained consistent and carefully neutral. Your adaptation appears genuine, Bradley concluded. However, I must remind you that any contact with relocated tribal members must be reported to federal authorities. Any claims to tribal lands will be viewed as potential fraud. After Bradley departed, Jacob and Ayana reviewed their performance. The interview had gone well, but the monthly scrutiny would require constant vigilance. We passed the first test, Jacob said. The first of many, Ayana replied. But each successful report will make future ones easier. Eventually, they'll view our marriage as settled fact rather than potential threat. As autumn deepened toward winter, their relationship evolved beyond mere partnership toward genuine affection. Jacob discovered that Ayana's intelligence extended far beyond cultural knowledge. She understood weather patterns, animal behavior, and land management with insights that improved ranch operations significantly. Ayana found that Jacob's willingness to sacrifice profitable opportunities for ethical principles matched her own commitment to preserving sacred traditions despite personal risk. Their marriage had begun as mutual necessity, but was growing into something approaching love. The transformation surprised them both with its Authenticity. Winter arrived with unprecedented fury, bringing blizzards that buried the valley under 6 feet of snow. The railroad construction crew, caught off guard by the early storms, abandoned their equipment and retreated to warmer territories until spring. Territorial officials postponed land surveys, and federal monitors suspended monthly visits until weather permitted safe travel. For the first time since their marriage, Jacob and Ayanna found themselves truly alone together. The isolation revealed aspects of their partnership that external pressures had kept hidden. Without constant surveillance and community scrutiny, they could explore the genuine feelings developing between them. Ayanna shared stories of her childhood, describing ceremonies that marked the changing seasons, explaining the spiritual significance of landmarks visible from their ranch house windows. "That peak to the north," she said one evening as they watched snow fall past the kitchen window, "is where young men go for vision quests. The spirits speak most clearly there during winter storms." Jacob studied the mountain she indicated, its summit lost in swirling clouds. What kind of visions do they seek? Understanding of their purpose, knowledge of the path they should follow in life, sometimes warnings about dangers to come. Ayanna's fingers traced patterns on the frosted glass. "My brother went there when he was 16. He came back knowing he would become a bridge between our people and the white world." Did your people have vision quests for women? Different traditions. Women receive guidance through dreams, through communion with plant spirits, through ceremonies that connect us to the earth's rhythms. Ayanna looked at him thoughtfully. "Your people seek visions too, but you call them dreams or ambitions." The conversation led Jacob to examine his own motivations with new clarity. His drive to expand the ranch, accumulate land, build wealth, these pursuits suddenly seemed narrow compared to Ayanna's understanding of purpose, connected to something larger than personal success. "What vision brought you to accept my proposal?" he asked. Ayanna considered her answer carefully. "I dreamed of a man who would choose difficult truths over easy profits. Someone who could learn to see this land as more than property to be owned." She smiled softly. "The dream didn't show me your face, but it showed me your heart." Outside, the wind howled through the mountains with voices that seemed to carry messages from distant places. Snow piled against the windows, creating a cocoon of warmth and intimacy around their developing relationship. During the long winter evenings, Ayanna taught Jacob to understand the subtle communications of the natural world. How to read weather patterns and cloud formations, interpret animal behavior that predicted seasonal changes, recognize the medicinal properties of plants that grew in their valley. "White medicine treats sickness after it appears," she explained, while showing him dried roots from her grandmother's collection. "Our medicine maintains balance before sickness can take hold." Jacob proved an eager student, his rancher's practical mind appreciating knowledge that could improve both animal and human health. Under Ayanna's guidance, he learned to identify herbs that could treat cattle ailments, plants that could supplement winter feed, natural remedies for the cuts and bruises that came with ranch work, but their deepest sharing occurred through physical intimacy that grew slowly from respectful distance toward genuine passion. Jacob had entered marriage expecting duty and companionship. He discovered desire that surprised him with its intensity. Ayanna had anticipated toleration and protection. She found herself drawn to a man whose gentle strength matched her own. Quiet determination. Their lovemaking became another form of communication, expressing emotions that words couldn't capture. In Jacob's careful attention to her pleasure, Ayanna felt respected and cherished. In her uninhibited responses, Jacob discovered passion he hadn't known he was capable of inspiring. "I never expected this," he whispered one night as they lay entwined before the fireplace. "What? To feel this way about someone I married for practical reasons." His fingers traced the line of her shoulder. "To want you so much it makes everything else seem unimportant." Ayanna shifted to look at him in the firelight. Perhaps the spirits guided us toward each other for reasons beyond preservation of sacred sites and federal land policies. You think we were meant to find each other? I think we needed each other in ways we didn't understand when we made our arrangement. Her hand rested over his heart. Your loneliness and my displacement, your search for meaning and my need for protection, they fit together like puzzle pieces. As winter deepened, they established routines that accommodated both ranch operations and traditional practices. Ayanna tended the cattle with Jacob during the day, her understanding of animal behavior proving invaluable during the harsh weather. At night, she performed ceremonies that marked lunar cycles and seasonal transitions, always careful to maintain practices that required no external fire or obvious activity. The medicine bundle from her father became their shared responsibility. Together, they cataloged the seeds and roots, researching their properties and ideal growing conditions. Ayanna taught Jacob the traditional songs that accompanied planting and harvesting, explaining how rhythm and melody were believed to enhance plant growth. Your people would consider this superstition, she said, as they sorted seeds by moonlight. My people would consider many things superstitious that actually work, Jacob replied. If singing helps plants grow, I'm willing to learn the songs. The deal. Revelation that Jacob would participate in traditional practices rather than merely tolerate them touched Ayanna profoundly. She had expected to preserve her culture in secret, hidden from a husband who might disapprove or report her activities to federal authorities. Instead, she found a partner willing to learn and support traditions he didn't fully understand. In February, a messenger arrived during a brief break in the weather. The young man had traveled for days through dangerous conditions, his urgent news written in running Wolf's careful script. Ayanna read the letter with growing concern, her face paling as she absorbed its contents. What is it? Jacob asked. My people are dying on the reservation. Inadequate food, poor shelter, diseases they have no resistance to. 23 deaths since winter began, including 3 children and 2 elders who carried important knowledge. Ayanna's voice remained steady, but tears tracked down her cheeks. The federal agent in charge has refused requests for additional supplies, claiming the allocation is sufficient for their needs. Jacob understood the implications immediately. The government's promise of care and support was proving as empty as their assurances of fair treatment. The tribal community faced deliberate neglect designed to reduce their numbers and eliminate their resistance to federal policies. Is there anything we can do? Ayanna reread the letter carefully. Running. Wolf asks if we can send supplies. Food, warm clothing, medicine. But he warns that any assistance could be traced back to us, used as evidence that I'm maintaining forbidden tribal connections. The moral dilemma crystallized Jacob's understanding of what Ayanna had sacrificed. She could save lives among her people, but only by risking the very arrangement that allowed her to preserve their cultural knowledge. Helping the reservation community would jeopardize her ability to maintain sacred sites and traditional ceremonies. We send the supplies, Jacob said without hesitation. You don't understand the risk. If federal authorities discover we're supporting the relocated tribe, they'll declare our marriage fraudulent. You'll lose your ranch, I'll be arrested for conspiracy, and the sacred sites will have no one to tend them. Some risks are worth taking. Jacob took her hands in his. We find a way to help your people without getting caught. The solution came through Marcus Sullivan, whose network of frontier contacts included freighters, traders, and merchants who moved goods across territorial boundaries without excessive documentation. Through carefully arranged transfers, they could send supplies to the reservation in ways that obscured their origin. Over the next month, Jacob quietly sold cattle and equipment to finance relief efforts. The transactions were legitimate business deals that raised no suspicion, but the proceeds went toward food, blankets, and medicine that would reach the reservation through circuitous routes. Ayanna contributed knowledge that made their assistance more effective. She prepared traditional remedies that could treat the specific ailments affecting her people, wrote detailed instructions for their preparation and use, included seeds for medicinal plants that could be cultivated on reservation land. This tea treats respiratory infections common in crowded conditions, she explained while packaging dried herbs. This ointment prevents frostbite when shelter is inadequate. These seeds will grow plants that provide nutrition missing from government rations. Their secret relief operation required careful coordination and constant vigilance. Supplies moved through multiple hands, payments were disguised as routine business transactions, and communication was limited to coded messages that appeared. To discuss weather and cattle prices. The work brought Jacob and Ayanna closer together, their shared commitment to helping others strengthening the emotional bonds between them. They were no longer just partners in a convenient arrangement. They were allies in a cause that transcended personal benefit. "I love you," Jacob said one evening as they packaged medicine for shipment. The words surprised him with their spontaneous truth. Ayanna looked up from her work, her eyes reflecting firelight and emotion. "I love you too. More than I thought possible when we made our practical arrangement." The admission transformed their relationship completely. What had begun as mutual necessity had evolved into genuine partnership, and finally into love that neither had expected to find. As spring approached, they received word that the first relief supplies had reached the reservation. The coded message from Running Wolf reported that 3 children's lives had been saved, 2 elders were recovering from pneumonia, and morale among the community had improved significantly. But success brought new dangers. Federal agents had begun investigating the source of unauthorized supplies reaching the reservation. Captain Hartford sent word that he would resume monthly monitoring visits as soon as weather permitted. The railroad company announced plans to complete construction beginning in April, bringing renewed attention to the valley and its inhabitants. "Everything is about to change again," Ayanna observed as they watched snow melt from the mountains. "Spring will bring federal agents, railroad workers, new settlers. Our privacy ends." Jacob nodded, understanding that their winter cocoon was dissolving. "Are you ready?" "I'm ready to face whatever comes next as your wife, as someone fighting to preserve what matters most." Ayanna's voice carried new strength, confidence born from months of successful deception and genuine love. "The spirits guided us through winter. They'll guide us through what follows." The approaching spring brought challenges they could barely imagine, but it also brought hope. Their marriage had survived federal scrutiny, community hostility, and the pressures of maintaining dual lives. More importantly, their love had grown strong enough to face whatever tests awaited them. On the first warm day of March, Jacob and Ayanna rode together to check the cattle wintering in North Pasture. The snow was retreating rapidly, revealing green grass underneath and exposing the sacred sites that Ayanna had tended secretly throughout the winter months. "Look," she said, pointing toward a distant hillside where something glinted in the sunlight. Jacob shaded his eyes and saw surveyors' stakes marking the proposed railroad route. The metal posts marched across the landscape like soldiers claiming territory, their bright flags announcing the return of federal attention to Thunder Ridge Valley. "It begins again," Ayanna said quietly. "Yes," Jacob agreed. "But this time we face it together, as partners who love each other rather than strangers bound by convenience." As they rode home through warming air filled with the promise of spring, both understood that their greatest challenges lay ahead. Federal agents would return, railroad construction would bring strangers to their valley, and the sacred sites would face new threats from development and settlement. But they also understood that their love had given them strength neither possessed alone. Together, they could protect what mattered most while building a future that honored both their heritages. The winter of isolation was ending, but the foundation it had built would endure through whatever storms followed. The railroad crew returned, in force during the first week of April, bringing with them a small army of engineers, surveyors, and laborers who transformed the quiet valley into a bustling construction zone. Steam shovels bit into sacred ground, dynamite blasts echoed off mountain walls, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers drove spikes into rails that would connect Thunder Ridge to the larger world. Jacob stood on his porch watching the transformation, his coffee growing cold in his hands. Where peaceful meadows had stretched toward distant peaks, temporary buildings now housed hundreds of workers. The construction camp sprawled across what had once been winter grazing land, complete with supply. Warehouses, equipment yards, and a makeshift saloon that operated around the clock. "They work even at night," Ayanna observed, joining him with her own cup of morning coffee. Dark circles under her eyes revealed that sleep had become elusive since construction began. Railroad companies don't waste time once they commit to a route. Jacob gestured toward the activity. Every day of delay costs them money, and investors demand results. The practical explanation couldn't mask the spiritual violence being inflicted on the landscape. Sacred sites that Ayanna had tended throughout the winter now faced destruction from progress that recognized no value beyond commercial utility. The burial ground where her ancestors rested lay directly in the path of the proposed depot, its ancient markers invisible to engineers who saw only level ground suitable for building. How long before they reached the sacred sites? She asked quietly. Jacob consulted the construction timeline he had obtained from the camp foreman. 3 weeks to the burial ground. 5 weeks to the Vision Quest peak. The main depot will be built directly over the place where your grandmother conducted healing ceremonies. The timetable felt like a countdown to cultural annihilation. Each passing day brought steam shovels closer to destroying connections that had existed for centuries, erasing physical landmarks that anchored spiritual traditions in specific geographical locations. But the railroad's arrival also brought unexpected opportunities. Dr. William Hayes, the company physician hired to tend construction injuries, proved to be a man of broad scientific interests who valued knowledge regardless of its cultural origins. When Ayanna demonstrated her skill treating a worker's infected wound with traditional plant medicines, Hayes requested detailed explanations of her methods. "Remarkable," he said, examining the rapid healing progression. "This poultice contains compounds I don't recognize, but the anti-inflammatory properties are clearly superior to conventional treatments." Ayanna hesitated before responding. Sharing medical knowledge with a white doctor could provide valuable documentation of traditional practices, but it also risked exposing her continued connections to tribal culture. "My grandmother taught me to identify healing plants. The knowledge has been passed down through generations of women in my family." Her explanation carefully avoided mentioning ongoing ceremonial practices or spiritual components of traditional medicine. "Would you be willing to share more of this knowledge? I could document the treatments, perhaps even arrange for publication in medical journals." Hayes's enthusiasm was genuine, but publication would create permanent records that federal authorities might use as evidence of unauthorized tribal activities. Jacob intervened carefully. "Dr. Hayes, my wife's knowledge comes from her upbringing, not from current connections to tribal communities. She's adapted her grandmother's teachings to help with ranch medical needs." The clarification established Ayanna's knowledge as historical inheritance rather than ongoing tribal practice, providing cover for her to share information without appearing to maintain forbidden cultural connections. Over the following weeks, Ayanna worked with Dr. Hayes to document traditional remedies, always framing her knowledge as childhood memories rather than active cultural participation. The collaboration produced detailed records of medicinal plants native to the valley, their preparation methods, and their applications for treating various ailments. This documentation could preserve important knowledge that might otherwise be lost, Hayes explained as they cataloged another treatment. Traditional medicines often contain active compounds that modern science can isolate and study. The irony struck Ayanna powerfully. She was preserving tribal knowledge by presenting it as historical curiosity rather than living tradition, saving cultural information by disguising it as scientific data. The approach felt like both victory and defeat, preserving the knowledge while severing its spiritual context. Meanwhile, the federal monitoring resumed with increased intensity. Lieutenant Bradley returned for his monthly visit accompanied by Agent Samuel Crawford, a federal investigator whose specialty involved detecting fraudulent marriages and unauthorized tribal communications. "Mrs. Morrison," Crawford began formally, "we understand you've been working with the railroad's physician. This represents significant adaptation to white society. Dr. Hayes has shown interest in the medicinal plants my grandmother taught me to identify. I'm pleased to share knowledge that might help people." Ayanna's response emphasized integration rather than cultural preservation. "Any knowledge you possess about tribal medical practices came from your previous life, not from ongoing contact with tribal communities?" Crawford's question probed for evidence of forbidden connections. "My grandmother died before the relocation. The knowledge she shared with me exists only in my memory." This answer was technically truthful while concealing the extent of Ayanna's continued cultural activities. Crawford's investigation extended beyond simple interviews. He examined the ranch's financial records, looking for evidence of payments to tribal communities or purchases that might support unauthorized communication. The relief supplies Jacob and Ayanna had sent to the reservation had been carefully disguised as legitimate business expenses, but sustained scrutiny might reveal inconsistencies. "Your cattle sales last winter exceeded normal patterns for ranch operations," Crawford observed while reviewing ledgers. "Can you explain the increased activity?" Jacob's answer came smoothly, prepared through careful rehearsal. "Harsh weather created feeding challenges. I sold additional head rather than risk losing them to starvation or disease." The explanation satisfied economic logic while concealing the true purpose of those sales. Crawford made notes but appeared convinced by the business rationale. But the agent's most dangerous investigation involved interviewing railroad workers and construction supervisors. Someone had reported seeing Ayanna alone in the mountains during early morning hours, behavior that could be interpreted as visiting sacred sites or maintaining tribal ceremonies. "Mrs. Morrison," Crawford said during a private interview, "several workers report observing you riding alone toward the northern peaks at dawn. Can you explain these activities?" Ayanna's heart raced, but her expression remained calm. "I enjoy watching the sunrise over the mountains. The beauty helps me appreciate my new life here." "You always ride alone? Your husband doesn't join these morning excursions?" "Jacob handles early ranch chores while I take personal time to appreciate the landscape. Solitude helps me feel connected to my new home." Her answer transformed spiritual ceremony into romantic sentiment, explaining her presence at sacred sites as aesthetic appreciation. Crawford pressed further. "Workers report you sometimes dismount and spend time at specific locations. What draws you to particular spots?" "Scenic viewpoints where mountain vistas are most beautiful. Places where wildflowers grow in unusual abundance. Locations that offer shelter from wind when weather is uncertain." Each explanation provided innocent reasons for visiting sacred sites. The interview continued for 2 hours, Crawford probing every aspect of Ayanna's activities for evidence of unauthorized tribal practices. Her answers maintained a consistent focus on integration, appreciation, and adaptation while concealing the spiritual significance of her actions. When Crawford finally departed, Jacob and Ayanna reviewed their performance with growing concern. The federal agent's suspicions were increasing rather than diminishing, and his investigation methods were becoming more sophisticated. "He doesn't believe our explanations," Ayanna said quietly. "He senses deception even though he can't prove it. What do? We become more careful, and we prepare for the possibility that being careful won't be enough." Ayanna's voice carried new gravity. If Crawford discovers evidence of tribal activities, we need a plan for protecting what matters most. The conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the door. Marcus Sullivan stood on the porch with news that would complicate their situation. Beyond imagination. Boss, you need to know something. Word from town is that Running Wolf has left the reservation. Federal agents are hunting him for unauthorized absence from assigned territory. Jacob felt his stomach drop. Running Wolf's disappearance would inevitably lead to questions about his sister's activities, increased scrutiny of her marriage, and possible discovery of their relief operations. How long has he been missing? 3 days. But here's the thing, Tommy Peterson at the general store says a young Indian was asking questions about the railroad construction, specifically about the burial ground location. The implications struck both Jacob and Ayanna simultaneously. Running Wolf had come to protect the sacred sites, but his presence would expose their secret preservation efforts and provide Crawford with evidence of unauthorized tribal communication. We have to find him before the federal agents do, Ayanna said urgently. If they capture him here, he'll be forced to reveal our activities. That night, Jacob and Ayanna rode into the mountains under cover of darkness, following trails that Ayanna remembered from childhood. They needed to locate Running Wolf and convince him to leave before his presence destroyed everything they had worked to preserve. The search led them to the highest sacred site, where vision seekers had traditionally sought spiritual guidance. They found Running Wolf sitting in meditation before a fire carefully hidden in a natural cave, his face bearing the weight of impossible decisions. "Sister," he said without surprise at their arrival, "I knew you would come. You have to leave. Federal agents are searching for you. If they find you here..." Ayanna's words carried desperate urgency. "I cannot leave while our ancestors' bones are being scattered by machinery. The spirits call for protection of sacred ground." Running Wolf's voice held unwavering determination. Jacob stepped forward. "There might be another way. Dr. Hayes, the railroad physician, has shown interest in preserving historical sites. If we can convince him that certain locations have archaeological significance, ... white man's science protecting Indian spirits?" Running Wolf's tone mixed skepticism with hope. "It's worth attempting. Archaeological preservation doesn't require acknowledging spiritual significance, but it could prevent destruction of burial sites." The plan took shape through rapid discussion. Dr. Hayes would be approached with evidence of historical significance at threatened locations. Archaeological value could justify construction delays or route modifications without acknowledging ongoing tribal connections. But implementing this strategy required Running Wolf to disappear before federal agents discovered his presence. His capture would unravel all their careful deceptions and expose the relief operations that had saved lives on the reservation. "We'll return to the reservation," Running Wolf agreed reluctantly. "But if archaeological protection fails, I will come back to defend our sacred places, regardless of the consequences." As dawn approached, Running Wolf prepared to begin his dangerous journey back to federal territory. His unauthorized absence would certainly result in punishment, but his capture near the sacred sites would result in catastrophe for everyone involved. "Tell our people that the traditions continue," he said to Ayanna as they parted. "Tell them that love has grown between worlds, that hope survives even in difficult circumstances." The siblings embraced with the knowledge that they might never see each other again. Running Wolf's return to the reservation would prevent his capture, but would also end their only communication link with the displaced tribal community. As Jacob and Ayanna rode home through morning light, both understood that their situation had reached a critical juncture. Crawford's investigation was intensifying. The railroad construction threatened sacred sites, and their secret preservation efforts had nearly been exposed. "We're running out of time," Ayanna said as they approached the ranch. "Then we make our remaining time count," Jacob replied. "We save what we can, protect what matters most, and face whatever consequences come from choosing love over safety. The railroad whistle echoed across the valley, its sound carrying promises of progress and threats of destruction in equal measure. Everything they had built together, their marriage, their love, their mission to preserve sacred knowledge, would soon face its ultimate test. Dr. Hayes proved more receptive to archaeological preservation than Jacob had dared hope. When presented with evidence of burial sites and ceremonial locations, the physician's scientific curiosity overcame his loyalty to railroad schedules. He had studied archaeology before pursuing medicine, and the prospect of documenting previously unknown historical sites captured his imagination completely. "These stone arrangements are clearly intentional," Hayes said as he examined markers Ayanna had carefully revealed near the proposed depot location. "The positioning follows astronomical patterns that suggest sophisticated understanding of celestial movements." Jacob watched nervously as Hayes measured distances between stone markers and recorded their positions relative to mountain peaks. The doctor's enthusiasm was encouraging, but his investigation also risked exposing the spiritual significance of sites that Ayanna had described only as possible archaeological interest. "How old do you estimate these structures to be?" Hayes asked while sketching the stone circle's configuration. "Very old," Ayanna replied carefully. "My grandmother spoke of them as existing since before her grandmother's time. Generations beyond memory." The answer provided historical depth without claiming specific knowledge that might suggest ongoing tribal connections. Hayes accepted the explanation while continuing his documentation, photographing stone arrangements and mapping their relationships to geographical features. "This discovery could delay construction for months," Hayes explained as he prepared his report. "Federal law requires archaeological assessment before disturbing sites of potential historical significance. The railroad company will resist, but they cannot ignore proper legal procedures." 3 days later, Hayes's report reached territorial authorities and triggered exactly the response he had predicted. Construction supervisor Daniel Kellerman arrived at the ranch with barely controlled fury, demanding explanations for delays that would cost the railroad thousands of dollars daily. "Morrison, I understand your wife has been filling Dr. Hayes's head with stories about Indian burial grounds. These delays are unacceptable." Kellerman's voice carried the authority of corporate investment and political connections. "The sites appear to have legitimate archaeological significance," Jacob replied calmly. "Dr. Hayes is following proper federal procedures." "Federal procedures be damned. We have contracts to fulfill, investors to satisfy, schedules to maintain." Kellerman gestured toward the construction equipment sitting idle. "Every day of delay costs money that comes directly from company profits." Ayanna emerged from the house carrying coffee for the men, her presence changing the conversation's dynamic. Kellerman studied her with calculating eyes, seeing not a person, but an obstacle to corporate efficiency. "Mrs. Morrison, your husband says you've identified archaeological sites on the proposed route. How exactly did you acquire this knowledge?" The question carried multiple layers of threat. Kellerman was probing for evidence that Ayanna's information came from ongoing tribal connections, rather than legitimate historical knowledge. "My grandmother shared stories about old places in this valley." When Dr. Hayes showed interest in historical sites, I remembered locations she had described. Ayanna's answer remained consistent with previous explanations while deflecting suspicion. Convenient stories from a dead grandmother just when construction threatens to disturb particular locations. Kellerman's skepticism was obvious. "Forgive me if I find the timing suspicious." Jacob stepped forward, his voice hardening. "Are you suggesting my wife is lying?" "I'm suggesting that archaeological claims require verification by qualified experts, not folklore from reservation Indians." Kellerman's language deliberately insulted Ayanna while challenging the legitimacy of her information. The confrontation escalated quickly. Jacob's hand moved toward his gun while Kellerman's posture suggested he was equally prepared for violence. Only Ayanna's intervention prevented bloodshed. "Gentlemen, we all want what's best for this valley. Perhaps we can find solutions that serve everyone's interests." Her diplomatic tone diffused the immediate tension while buying time for cooler minds to prevail. Kellerman agreed to await the federal archaeological assessment, but his departure carried promises of future conflict. The railroad company would not accept delays indefinitely, and their political influence might override archaeological protections if financial pressures became too intense. That evening, Agent Crawford returned unexpectedly with additional federal investigators. His team included specialists in marriage fraud, tribal law violations, and unauthorized communication with relocated communities. The scope of their investigation had expanded far beyond routine monitoring. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," Crawford announced formally, "we have received reports suggesting fraudulent activities related to your marriage and possible violations of federal tribal relocation policies." Jacob felt his blood turn cold. Someone had provided information that went beyond suspicion to specific accusations. The question was who had betrayed them and what evidence had been discovered. "What specific allegations are you investigating?" Jacob asked. "Unauthorized communication with reservation communities, financial support for relocated tribal members, use of marriage to circumvent federal land policies." Crawford's list covered all their secret activities with disturbing accuracy. "We have violated no laws," Ayanna said firmly. "Our marriage is legitimate, and we have maintained no forbidden communications." "Then you won't object to a comprehensive investigation of your activities, financial records, and personal correspondence?" Crawford's statement was presented as a question, but refusal would constitute evidence of guilt. The investigation began immediately. Federal agents searched the ranch house thoroughly, examining every document, letter, and personal possession for evidence of tribal connections. They questioned Marcus Sullivan extensively about ranch operations, supply purchases, and any unusual activities he might have observed. The medicinal herbs Ayanna had prepared for Dr. Hayes's documentation became suspicious evidence. Her detailed knowledge of plant properties suggested ongoing cultural practices rather than childhood memories. The investigators cataloged every root, seed, and dried leaf as potential proof of unauthorized tribal activities. This level of knowledge exceeds what could be learned from childhood instruction, Agent Morrison observed while examining Ayanna's herbal collection. These preparations require active practice to maintain such expertise. Ayanna's explanation emphasized practical necessity. Ranch life requires knowledge of natural remedies. Animals and people both need medical attention when doctors are unavailable. But the investigators' most damaging discovery came from examining financial records with accounting expertise that revealed patterns Jacob and Ayanna had thought were carefully concealed. The cattle sales, supply purchases, and money transfers that had funded their relief operations showed clear anomalies when analyzed by specialists. "These transactions don't align with normal ranch operations," Agent Crawford announced after reviewing the ledgers. "The timing, amounts, and recipients suggest coordination with external parties." Jacob's carefully prepared explanations suddenly seemed inadequate when confronted with forensic accounting analysis. The pattern of sales and purchases told a story that contradicted their claims of independence from tribal communities. "We sold cattle to meet changing market conditions and ranch maintenance needs," Jacob insisted, but his words lacked conviction when faced with documentary evidence. The investigation continued for 3 days, agents methodically dismantling the careful facade Jacob and Ayanna had constructed. Their love remained genuine, but the circumstances surrounding their marriage appeared increasingly suspicious when examined by federal investigators trained to detect deception. On the 4th day, Crawford delivered his preliminary findings in a voice that carried the weight of federal authority. The evidence suggests a pattern of activities inconsistent with legitimate marriage and proper compliance with tribal relocation policies. While we cannot prove intentional fraud, the circumstances warrant continued federal oversight and possible legal action. The verdict fell short of immediate arrest but promised ongoing scrutiny that would make normal life impossible. Jacob and Ayanna would live under constant surveillance, their every action monitored for evidence that could support criminal charges. Crawford's investigation had one unintended consequence that would prove crucial to their survival. Dr. Hayes's archaeological report reached federal authorities just as the marriage fraud investigation reached its climax, creating competing governmental priorities that complicated Crawford's simple narrative. The territorial governor, influenced by political pressure from the railroad company, wanted construction delays minimized and archaeological obstacles eliminated. But the federal government's Bureau of Indian Affairs supported preservation of historically significant sites, especially when such preservation demonstrated respect for tribal heritage without acknowledging ongoing tribal claims. The archaeological findings present a delicate political situation, explained Judge Harrison when he arrived to review Crawford's investigation. Destroying documented historical sites would create controversy that extends beyond territorial boundaries. The political complexity created opportunities that pure legal arguments could not achieve. Archaeological preservation satisfied federal requirements for respecting tribal heritage while avoiding recognition of ongoing tribal rights. The burial sites could be protected as historical artifacts rather than sacred locations. Judge Harrison's solution surprised everyone with its diplomatic sophistication. The archaeological sites will be preserved as federally protected historical landmarks. The railroad route will be modified to avoid disturbance of documented locations. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison will continue under federal monitoring, but no criminal charges will be filed pending completion of the archaeological assessment. The decision represented partial victory wrapped in continued danger. The sacred sites would be protected, but Jacob and Ayanna's activities would remain under federal scrutiny. Their relief operations for the reservation community would have to end, and their cultural preservation efforts would require even greater secrecy. That evening, as federal agents departed and relative quiet returned to the valley, Jacob and Ayanna assessed their new circumstances. They had saved the burial sites, but at the cost of their privacy and freedom. The archaeological protection would preserve physical locations but could not maintain the spiritual practices that gave those locations meaning. "We won something important," Ayanna said as they watched the last federal wagon disappear down the valley road. "The ancestors' resting places will not be disturbed." "But at what cost?" Jacob replied. "We can't help your people on the reservation anymore. We can't maintain the ceremonies that connect you to those protected sites. We've preserved empty shells while losing their spiritual contents." Ayanna considered his words carefully. Perhaps preserving empty shells is still worthwhile if it keeps hope alive for the future. Maybe someday my people will return, and the protected sites will be waiting for them. Her optimism touched something deep in Jacob's heart. Despite losing so much, she continued to find reasons for hope. Her determination to preserve possibilities rather than just physical locations inspired him to look beyond immediate defeats toward longer-term victories. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We adapt. We find new ways to maintain traditions under federal oversight. We continue loving each other and this land, even if we must do so more carefully." Ayanna's voice carried quiet strength. "The spirits guided us this far. They will guide us through whatever comes next." Over the following weeks, they developed new routines that accommodated constant surveillance while maintaining essential activities. Ayanna's morning rides became carefully orchestrated exercises in appearing to enjoy scenic beauty while secretly tending sacred sites. Her work with Dr. Hayes continued, but with greater emphasis on scientific documentation rather than cultural. Preservation. The railroad construction resumed with modifications that avoided the protected archaeological sites. The new route added weeks to the construction timeline and thousands of dollars to the project cost, but federal law provided no alternatives. Workers grumbled about delays and detours, but they complied with orders from supervisors who understood. The political sensitivity of their situation. Dr. Hayes proved unexpectedly supportive during this transition period. His archaeological report had provided the legal framework for site protection, but his personal commitment extended beyond professional obligations. I understand there are aspects of these sites that pure archaeology cannot capture, he told Ayanna during one of their documentation sessions. Cultural significance often transcends what science can measure or preserve. His words suggested understanding that went beyond official acknowledgement. Hayes recognized the spiritual importance of the protected sites, even though he could not publicly support ongoing tribal connections. Knowledge preservation takes many forms, Ayanna replied carefully. Sometimes the important thing is ensuring that future generations have the opportunity to rediscover what current circumstances force us to protect indirectly. The conversation established a subtle alliance that would prove valuable in months to come. Hayes would continue documenting traditional knowledge under the guise of historical research, creating records that could someday serve restoration efforts, even if immediate cultural practice remained impossible. As summer progressed, Jacob and Ayanna settled into their new reality. Their love had deepened through shared trials, their commitment strengthened by choosing principles over safety. The sacred sites remained protected, traditional knowledge was being documented, and their marriage had survived federal investigation, but challenges remained. Agent Crawford's monthly visits continued with undiminished intensity. The railroad company pressured federal authorities to minimize archaeological delays. Most critically, communication with the reservation community had been severed, leaving them uncertain about the fate of people they had risked everything to help. On a warm evening in late August, as they sat on their porch watching construction, lights twinkle in the distance, Ayanna made an observation that captured both their losses and their gains. "We have become bridge people," she said quietly. "No longer fully part of either world, but connected to both. Perhaps that is what the spirits intended when they brought us together." Jacob took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of shared work and shared commitment. "Then we make the bridge strong enough to carry others across safely." Their journey together was far from over, but they had survived its most dangerous passages. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them as partners who had chosen love over convenience, principle over profit, and hope over despair. The first sign of deeper trouble came with the autumn cattle roundup. Jacob discovered that his herd had grown by 30 head over the summer, animals bearing brands he didn't recognize, mixed in with his own stock as if they had always belonged on his range. Marcus Sullivan brought the discrepancy to his attention with barely concealed worry. "Boss, these aren't strays that wandered in from neighboring ranches. These brands belong to the territorial government's experimental breeding program. Someone deliberately moved federal cattle onto our land." Jacob examined the foreign brands while his mind raced through implications. Government cattle appearing on his ranch could be interpreted as theft, illegal appropriation of federal property, or evidence of fraudulent schemes to manipulate territorial livestock programs. Any idea how they got here? None that makes sense. The government facility is 200 miles south. These animals would have had to be driven here deliberately, through multiple territorial boundaries, past numerous ranches where they would have been noticed. Marcus's expression showed the same confusion Jacob felt. Ayanna joined them at the corral, her trained eye immediately recognizing the problem. "Someone wants these cattle found here. This is not an accident or mistake." Her assessment struck to the heart of the matter. The cattle's presence served someone's purpose. But the question was whose plan they were unwittingly serving, and what consequences would follow discovery. The answer came 3 days later when Agent Crawford returned with a full investigative team and a federal warrant authorizing seizure of stolen government property. His arrival coincided suspiciously with the cattle roundup, suggesting that whoever had planted the animals had also informed federal authorities of their location. "Mr. Morrison," Crawford announced with obvious satisfaction, "you are under arrest for theft of federal property and conspiracy to defraud territorial livestock programs." Jacob's protestation of innocence fell on deaf ears. The evidence appeared conclusive: government cattle on his ranch, brands that could be verified through federal records, animals that had clearly been on his property for months based on their integration with his herd. "I have never stolen anything from the government. These cattle appeared on my land without my knowledge or consent." "A convenient claim that cannot be verified," Crawford replied while federal agents began separating the government animals from Jacob's legitimate stock. "The cattle are here, they bear federal brands, and you failed to report their presence, despite months of opportunity to do so." The legal framework of the charges revealed their true purpose. Conviction for federal theft would result in forfeiture of the ranch, dissolution of Jacob's marriage under territorial law governing criminal activity, and Ayana's immediate deportation to the reservation as the wife of a convicted felon. "This is a setup," Jacob said bluntly. "Someone planted those cattle to create grounds for these charges." "Prove it," Crawford challenged. "Provide evidence that these animals were placed here without your knowledge. Demonstrate who had the means and motivation to orchestrate such an elaborate frame." The challenge was impossible to meet. Whoever had planned this operation had covered their tracks too carefully, leaving only the incriminating evidence of federal cattle on Jacob's property and the legal consequences that would follow. But Crawford's confidence revealed a crucial weakness in the frame. He was too eager, too satisfied with the apparent success of his operation. His behavior suggested personal investment beyond professional duty, implying that he had orchestrated the setup rather than merely investigating crimes reported by others. Ayana recognized the pattern immediately. "Agent Crawford, your investigation has been remarkably focused from the beginning. You seem to have anticipated finding evidence that proves our guilt rather than determining whether guilt actually exists." The observation struck home. Crawford's methods had consistently assumed criminal activity rather than investigating whether such activity had actually occurred. His persistent surveillance, increasingly intrusive searches, and predetermined conclusions suggested bias that exceeded professional objectivity. "I follow evidence wherever it leads," Crawford replied defensively. "Do you? Or do you create evidence that leads where you want it to go?" Ayana's question challenged the fundamental integrity of the investigation. The confrontation revealed more than Crawford intended. His facial expression and body language betrayed knowledge that innocent investigators should not possess. He knew too much about the cattle's movements, their brands, and their timing to be merely responding to reported crimes. Jacob seized on this revelation. "You know exactly how those cattle got here because you arranged for them to be placed here. This entire investigation has been fabricated to achieve predetermined results." Crawford's denial came too quickly and with too much anger. "That's a serious accusation against a federal agent. I suggest you focus on defending yourself against proven charges rather than making wild claims about law enforcement misconduct." But the damage was done. Crawford's reaction had revealed his personal involvement in creating the very crimes he was investigating. The question was how to prove this misconduct and use it to defend against the charges he had manufactured. Dr. Hayes provided an unexpected solution. His archaeological documentation work had required extensive correspondence with federal authorities, creating a paper trail that revealed the timeline of Crawford's investigation and its relationship to other federal activities in the region. The Cattle theft charges are dated 3 days before the Archaeological Protection Order was finalized, Hayes explained as he reviewed official documents. But Crawford's investigation reports reference evidence that could only have been discovered after the protection order was issued. The chronological inconsistency proved that Crawford had knowledge of future events, suggesting advanced planning rather than responsive investigation. His reports contained information that legitimate investigators could not have possessed at the time they were supposedly written. This proves Crawford was planning charges against you before the evidence allegedly appeared, Hayes continued. The investigation was designed to achieve specific results rather than determine facts. Armed with this evidence, Jacob and Ayanna requested a federal hearing to challenge the charges against them. Judge Harrison agreed to review the case. His own suspicions aroused by the timing and circumstances of Crawford's investigation. The hearing revealed a web of corruption that extended beyond Agent Crawford to include railroad company officials, territorial politicians, and federal bureaucrats who had conspired to eliminate obstacles to corporate development plans. The Archaeological Protection Order had disrupted profitable construction schedules, creating powerful enemies who wanted Jacob and Ayanna removed from the equation. The evidence suggests a coordinated effort to manufacture criminal charges against Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, Judge Harrison concluded after reviewing testimony and documentation. Agent Crawford's investigation shows clear signs of bias and procedural misconduct that undermines the credibility of his findings. Crawford's career ended with his dismissal from federal service and criminal charges for evidence tampering and conspiracy. The cattle theft charges against Jacob were dismissed, but the experience had revealed the depth of opposition their activities had generated among powerful interests. "We've made enemies we didn't know we had," Jacob observed as they returned home from the hearing. "And allies we didn't know we needed," Ayanna replied, thinking of Dr. Hayes's crucial support and Judge Harrison's willingness to challenge federal misconduct. The victory came with sobering recognition of their vulnerability. Corporate interests had sufficient power and motivation to manufacture criminal charges, corrupt federal agents, and manipulate territorial politics. Their success in exposing this corruption had eliminated immediate threats, but had also identified them as opponents worthy of continued attention. Over the following months, they adapted their activities to address these new realities. The archaeological protection had saved the sacred sites, but maintaining their spiritual significance required ongoing stewardship that federal monitoring made increasingly difficult. Ayanna developed subtle methods for continuing traditional practices under surveillance. Her morning rides included prayers that appeared to be silent contemplation. Her plant gathering looked like botanical hobby rather than ceremonial preparation. Her seasonal observations resembled weather monitoring rather than spiritual ceremony. "I am becoming a ghost of myself," she confided to Jacob one evening. Maintaining traditions through mimicry rather than authentic practice, Jacob understood her frustration. The federal protection had preserved physical locations, but could not protect the cultural activities that gave those locations meaning. They had saved the sacred sites while losing the ability to keep them truly sacred, but their relationship continued to deepen despite external pressures. The trials they had faced together had created bonds that transcended the practical arrangements of their original marriage. Their love had been tested by federal investigation, corporate conspiracy, and cultural displacement, emerging stronger for having survived these challenges. "Do you ever regret accepting my proposal?" Jacob asked during one of their quiet evening conversations. "Do you regret making it?" Ayanna countered. "Never. Even knowing what we would face, even understanding the costs, I would make the same choice again." Jacob's answer carried absolute certainty. "Then we both chose correctly, regardless of the difficulties we have encountered." Ayanna's smile carried warmth that had grown through shared trials. Love that survives such testing is worth whatever sacrifices it requires. Their conversation was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. A young woman approached their ranch house on horseback, her exhausted mount and travel-stained clothes suggesting urgent need. She dismounted unsteadily, fatigue evident in every movement. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, my name is Sarah Whitehorse. I've traveled from the reservation to ask for your help." Jacob and Ayanna exchanged quick glances. Contact with reservation residents remained forbidden under federal monitoring agreements, but humanitarian needs superseded political restrictions. "What kind of help?" Ayanna asked carefully. "Medicine, knowledge, hope." Sarah's voice carried desperation mixed with determination. "The federal supplies promised to our people have not arrived. Children are dying from diseases that traditional medicine could treat, but our healers were forbidden to bring plant medicines during relocation. The situation presented impossible choices. Helping reservation residents would violate federal agreements and provide evidence that could support renewed criminal charges. But allowing children to die when they possessed knowledge and materials to help seemed morally unacceptable." "How did you know to come here?" Jacob asked. Running Wolf spoke of his sister before federal agents silenced him. He said she had found a way to preserve traditional knowledge, even in white society. Sarah's explanation revealed that their activities were known on the reservation, despite severed communication. Ayanna made her decision immediately. "I will prepare medicines and instructions for their use. You can carry them back disguised as personal supplies. The federal monitors ... double quotes Jacob began. "Will not know unless someone reports our activities. Some risks are worth taking." Ayanna's voice carried the same determination that had sustained her through months of cultural preservation under impossible circumstances. They worked through the night preparing medicines and detailed instructions for treating the specific illnesses affecting reservation children. Ayanna's knowledge proved extensive enough to address multiple medical needs while providing guidance that non-specialists could follow safely. "These herbs treat respiratory infections common in crowded conditions," she explained while packaging remedies. "This preparation reduces fever and inflammation. These instructions show how to recognize dangerous symptoms that require immediate attention." Sarah memorized the information with desperate intensity, understanding that this knowledge might be her people's only hope for surviving federal neglect. Her gratitude was evident but unspoken, both women recognizing that excessive thanks might be overheard by hostile ears. As dawn approached, Sarah prepared to begin her dangerous return journey. Discovery by federal patrols would result in severe punishment for unauthorized absence from assigned territory. But returning empty-handed would mean watching children die from treatable illnesses. "Tell Running Wolf that traditions continue," Ayanna said as they parted. "Tell him that love has grown between worlds, that hope survives even when hope seems impossible." Sarah's departure left Jacob and Ayanna with renewed understanding of their mission's importance. They were not merely preserving cultural knowledge as historical curiosity, but maintaining lifelines that could save lives when official systems failed. "We're walking a dangerous path," Jacob observed as they watched Sarah disappear into morning shadows. "The most worthwhile paths usually are dangerous," Ayanna replied. "But love that refuses to act when action is needed isn't really love at all." Their conversation established new parameters for their relationship and their mission. They would continue preserving traditional knowledge and helping their displaced people despite federal surveillance and corporate opposition. The risks were enormous, but the alternative, passive acceptance of cultural destruction and human suffering, was morally unacceptable. As autumn progressed toward winter, they prepared for challenges that would test not only their commitment to each other, but their dedication to principles that transcended personal safety. Their love had survived federal investigation and corporate conspiracy. Now it would face the ultimate test of whether it was strong enough to justify the sacrifices it demanded from both of them. The telegram arrived on a bitter February morning. its message transforming everything Jacob and Ayanna had fought to preserve. Marcus Sullivan rode through knee-deep snow to deliver news that would either vindicate their struggle or destroy everything they had built together. "Boss," this came through the territorial office, marked urgent federal priority. Marcus's breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he handed over the yellow paper with trembling fingers, whether from cold or anticipation. Jacob couldn't tell. The telegram bore the seal of the Department of Interior and was signed by Secretary Carl Schurz himself. Jacob read the message twice before its implications fully registered, then handed it to Ayanna with hands that shook slightly. Stop congressional investigation into tribal relocation policies. Reveals systematic violations of federal law. Stop Thunder Ridge Valley, designated pilot. Program for voluntary tribal return. Stop archaeological sites to serve as cultural preservation. Center, stop your cooperation requested in establishing model integration community. Stop full federal protection authorized. Stop Schurz Interior. Ayanna read the words several times, her dark eyes reflecting disbelief mixed with hope. She had thought. Permanently extinguished. They want our people to come home. The transformation in federal policy had emerged from a congressional investigation that exposed the corruption Crawford had represented. Dr. Hayes's archaeological documentation had reached influential politicians who saw an opportunity to demonstrate progressive policies toward tribal communities. The Thunder Ridge model would showcase enlightened federal approaches to cultural preservation and voluntary integration. "It's what we dreamed of but never dared to expect," Jacob said quietly. "Your people returning to sacred lands, traditional knowledge preserved and protected by federal law, integration based on respect rather than forced assimilation." But the telegram also carried implicit warnings. The pilot program would operate under intense federal scrutiny, with success or failure determining whether similar policies would be implemented elsewhere. Any hint of tribal militancy, federal law violations, or cultural separatism would provide ammunition for opponents who viewed forced assimilation as the only viable policy. "We would become symbols," Ayanna observed. "Our marriage, our community, our success or failure would represent the possibility of peaceful coexistence between cultures." The weight of representation felt enormous. They had struggled to preserve sacred sites and traditional knowledge for its own sake. Now their efforts would be evaluated as proof of whether Native and white communities could coexist successfully. 3 weeks later, the first wagon train of returning tribal members appeared on the horizon like a vision emerging from winter storms. Chief Standing Bear led the procession, his weathered face bearing the marks of reservation hardships, but also carrying dignity that federal policies had been unable to break. Running Wolf rode beside his father, his presence explaining how congressional investigators had learned about Thunder Ridge conditions. His testimony about systematic corruption, medical neglect, and forced cultural destruction had provided the political ammunition necessary to challenge existing policies. "Sister, Running," Wolf called as he dismounted, embracing Ayanna with joy that words could not express. "The spirits guided us home." The reunion carried emotional weight that transcended political significance. Families separated by federal policies were reunited with the land that anchored their spiritual identity. Children who had never seen their ancestral home walked the ground their grandparents had described in stories. Elders touched sacred sites they had thought never to visit again, but the return also brought challenges that had not existed before the forced relocation. The tribal community now numbered less than half its original size, many members having died on the reservation or chosen to remain in the unfamiliar territory they had been forced to adopt. The survivors carried trauma from years of cultural suppression and medical neglect. The railroad construction had permanently altered the valley's landscape. Though the sacred sites remained protected, the depot and rail lines had created a commercial infrastructure that brought strangers noise, and economic pressures that complicated traditional life patterns. Most significantly, the returning community would have to establish relationships with white settlers who had claimed lands during the tribal absence. Some neighbors proved welcoming, others remained hostile, and many fell somewhere between acceptance and suspicion. Jacob found himself serving as unofficial mediator between communities that viewed each other with uncertainty. His marriage to Ayanna and his role in protecting sacred sites had earned tribal trust, while his established presence in the territory provided credibility with white settlers. The success of this integration depends on both communities choosing cooperation over conflict. Judge Harrison explained during a meeting that brought together tribal leaders, federal officials, and territorial representatives. Mr. Morrison, your unique position makes you crucial to demonstrating that such cooperation is possible. The pressure of representation extended beyond personal relationships to economic arrangements that would determine the community's long-term viability. The returning tribal members needed land for housing and agriculture, but territorial law recognized only white settlers' claims to property that had once been tribal territory. Dr. Hayes proposed a solution that drew on his archaeological expertise and political connections. The Cultural Preservation Center would employ tribal members as guides, interpreters, and specialists in traditional knowledge. Federal funding would support research and education programs that showcase the value of preserved cultural practices. Traditional ecological knowledge could inform modern agricultural and environmental management, Hayes explained to skeptical federal officials. Tribal medicinal practices could contribute to medical research and frontier healthcare. Cultural preservation becomes economic development rather than federal charity. The proposal appealed to politicians seeking to demonstrate that progressive policies could achieve practical benefits. Federal investment in cultural preservation would generate knowledge with commercial applications, creating economic justification for policies that might otherwise be dismissed as sentimental charity. Ayanna found herself at the center of these efforts, her preserved knowledge serving as the foundation for programs that would validate the entire integration experiment. The medicinal plants she had secretly cultivated would become the basis for research partnerships with territorial universities. The seasonal ceremonies she had maintained in solitude would become educational demonstrations for visitors interested in traditional ecological practices. I never imagined my quiet preservation efforts would become so public, she confided to Jacob as they watched construction begin on the cultural center. Everything I kept hidden will now be displayed for strangers to observe and judge. Jacob understood her ambivalence. The publicity that would validate their preservation efforts would also transform private spiritual practices into public demonstrations, changing their essential nature even while protecting their continued existence. Is it worth the compromise? He asked. Ayanna considered the question while watching tribal children play in the shadow of railroad equipment, their laughter mixing traditional games with the innovations learned during reservation years. If compromise allows our knowledge to survive and our people to remain connected to this land, then yes, adaptation is survival. The cultural center opened 6 months later with ceremonies that attracted visitors from across the territory and beyond. Newspaper reporters documented traditional practices, federal officials observed integration progress, and tourists paid admission fees that would fund ongoing operations. But the most meaningful validation came from tribal elders who pronounced the preserved sites properly maintained and the traditional knowledge accurately transmitted. Ayanna's solitary efforts during the forced separation had successfully bridged the gap between past and present, ensuring cultural continuity despite government attempts at forced assimilation. The ancestors are pleased, Chief Standing Bear announced during the opening ceremony. Their wisdom lives in new forms but retains its essential truth. The success of the Thunder Ridge model influenced federal policy throughout the territory and beyond. Other communities received authorization for voluntary tribal returns. Archaeological sites gained protection as cultural resources. And integration based on mutual respect became official policy rather than punitive exception. Jacob and Ayana's marriage, once viewed with suspicion by both communities, became a symbol of successful cultural bridge building. Their love story was featured in territorial newspapers as proof that different peoples could create shared futures without abandoning distinct identities, but personal happiness remained their most important achievement. The practical arrangement that had brought them together had evolved into love that enriched both their lives. The challenges they had faced had strengthened rather than strained their relationship, proving that partnerships built on mutual respect and shared values could survive extraordinary pressures. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had refused my brother's proposal? Running Wolf asked Jacob during a community celebration marking the first anniversary of the tribal return. Jacob looked across the gathering where Ayana was teaching traditional plant preparation to a group of white and native children working together with natural ease. I try not to think about missed opportunities. The path we took led us here, and here feels like exactly where we were meant to be. The celebration continued late into the evening, with traditional dancing mixed with frontier music, tribal foods shared alongside ranchers' barbecue, and stories told in both languages to audiences that included people from multiple cultures. As the evening wound down, Jacob and Ayana walked together toward their ranch house, their path illuminated by firelight from the continuing celebration and starlight from the clear mountain sky. 5 years ago, I thought I would live and die as a lonely rancher accumulating land and counting cattle, Jacob said as they reached their porch. I never imagined finding love, purpose, and a community worth preserving. 5 years ago, I thought our people's traditions would die with the elders on a distant reservation, Ayana replied. I never imagined seeing children learn traditional songs in the shadow of protected sacred sites. They sat together on the porch steps, listening to the sounds of their transformed valley. The railroad whistle still echoed off mountain walls, but it no longer carried threats of cultural destruction. The depot served visitors coming to learn about traditional ecological practices, rather than tourists viewing cultural curiosities. The integration they had made possible honored both heritage and progress. What happens next? Jacob asked. We continue building the bridge we became, Ayana said softly. We keep proving that love can connect different worlds without requiring either to lose its essential identity. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a young couple walking hand in hand from the celebration. Jacob recognized them as Thomas Mitchell, a railroad engineer who had stayed in the valley after construction ended, and Mary Strongheart, a young woman from the returned tribal community. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, Thomas called out. We wanted to thank you for showing us that different kinds of people can build happy lives together. Mary stepped forward with traditional shyness mixed with modern confidence. We're planning our own marriage, and we hope it can be as successful as yours has been. Jacob and Ayana exchanged glances that carried years of shared experiences, challenges overcome, and love deepened through trials neither had anticipated when they first agreed to their practical arrangement. The most important thing is choosing to face difficulties together rather than allowing them to drive you apart, Ayana advised. Love grows stronger when it survives testing. And remember that building bridges between different worlds requires patience, understanding, and willingness to learn from each other, Jacob added. But the results are worth whatever challenges you encounter. As the young couple continued toward their own futures, Jacob and Ayana remained on their porch, comfortable in the silence that came from complete understanding between partners who had chosen love over convenience, principle over profit, and hope over despair. The mountain wind carried the scent of traditional sage mixed with railroad smoke, traditional cooking fires mixed with modern chimney smoke, the sounds of different languages and different musics blending into something new but respectful of old traditions. "I love you," Jacob said simply, the words carrying weight earned through shared trials and deepened through shared victories. "I love you too," Ayanna replied, her voice holding the warmth of someone who had found home in the most unexpected place and the most unexpected way. Above them, the same stars that had witnessed their first tentative conversations now illuminated a transformed valley, where different peoples lived in harmony, where sacred sites remained protected while progress continued, where love had indeed proven stronger than fear. Their story had become part of the larger story of a changing territory, but their personal happiness remained the foundation that made all other achievements possible. They had chosen each other when choice seemed impossible, loved each other when love seemed impractical, and built together a future that honored both their heritage and their shared dreams. The Thunder Ridge Valley had become home to a new kind of community, one that proved integration based on mutual respect could succeed where forced assimilation had failed. And at the center of this success stood a marriage that had begun as practical necessity and had grown into love that would endure long after the specific challenges that had brought them together were resolved. As they finally rose to enter their house, Jacob paused to look back at the valley spread below them. The protected sacred sites remained unchanged, their spiritual significance maintained by people who understood their importance. The railroad depot bustled with respectful visitors rather than threatening invaders. The cultural center glowed with lights from evening classes where different peoples learned from each other. "We did something good here," he said quietly. "We did something necessary," Ayanna corrected gently. "We proved that love can bridge any distance, overcome any obstacle, and create possibilities that fear insists are impossible." Their front door closed behind them, but their story continued in the lives they had touched, the policies they had influenced, and the love they had chosen to nurture despite every reason to choose otherwise. The Thunder Ridge Valley would remember their courage, their commitment, and their proof that sometimes the most practical arrangements can grow into the most extraordinary love stories. In the end, they had saved more than sacred sites and traditional knowledge. They had saved the possibility of hope itself, demonstrating that even in the darkest circumstances, love could find a way to create light that would guide others toward their own unexpected possibilities. The mountain stars bore witness to their contentment as they settled into the peace that comes from knowing that love, once chosen and nurtured through difficulty, becomes strong enough to withstand whatever challenges the future might bring. Their bridge between worlds had become a foundation for others to build upon, ensuring that their love story would continue in the lives of all who learned that different peoples, different cultures, and different hearts could indeed find ways to beat in harmony. 2 years later, the Thunder Ridge Cultural Preservation Center had become a destination that attracted scholars, government officials, and visitors from across the continent. The success of the integration model had inspired similar programs in 12 other territories, with Jacob and Ayanna frequently called upon to advise communities attempting their own cultural bridge-building efforts. Dr. Hayes had documented over 300 traditional medicinal treatments, many of which were being studied by medical colleges for potential pharmaceutical applications. The economic value of this preserved knowledge had silenced critics who had argued that cultural preservation was merely sentimental charity without practical benefits. Traditional ecological knowledge is revolutionizing our understanding of sustainable agriculture, Professor Elizabeth Warren from the Eastern Agricultural Institute explained during her third research visit to Thunder Ridge. The seasonal planting cycles and soil management techniques preserved here could transform farming practices across the frontier. Ayanna had become something she never expected, a teacher whose students included university professors, federal agriculture specialists, and territorial development planners. Her knowledge, once hidden to avoid persecution, now commanded respect from the highest levels of government and academia. But the most profound changes had occurred within the tribal community itself. Children who had been born on the reservation were learning traditional songs, dances, and stories in the shadow of the sacred sites their grandparents had thought they would never see again. The cultural continuity that Ayana had preserved through solitary ceremony was now being transmitted to a new generation through community celebration. "Our young people speak 2 languages and live in 2 worlds," Chief Standing Bear observed. During a council meeting that included both tribal leaders and territorial representatives, they understand traditional wisdom and modern opportunities. This is adaptation that strengthens rather than weakens our people. The economic integration had exceeded even optimistic projections. Tribal members worked as guides for the cultural center, specialists in traditional agriculture techniques, and consultants for various research projects. Their income provided economic independence while their work preserved and transmitted cultural knowledge. Jacob's ranch had expanded to become a demonstration site for integrated land management, where traditional ecological practices were combined with modern ranching techniques. Visitors came to observe how native understanding of seasonal cycles and natural systems could improve both agricultural productivity and environmental sustainability. "We're proving that progress doesn't require destroying what came before," Jacob explained to a group of territorial legislators who were considering similar integration programs in their districts. "Traditional knowledge and modern methods can strengthen each other when they're combined respectfully." The success had attracted attention from Washington, where federal Indian policy was undergoing fundamental reconsideration. Secretary Schertz had visited Thunder Ridge personally, bringing with him congressional representatives who were drafting legislation to extend the integration model throughout federal territories. "What you've accomplished here challenges every assumption about tribal-white relations," Congressman James Mitchell told Jacob and Ayana during an official inspection tour. "You've demonstrated that voluntary integration based on mutual respect achieves better results than forced assimilation through cultural destruction." But the political attention also brought new pressures. Their private love story had become a public symbol, their personal choices scrutinized as evidence of whether cultural integration could succeed on a national scale. Every aspect of their relationship was analyzed by supporters and critics seeking to prove broader points about federal policy. "Sometimes I miss our privacy," Ayana confided to Jacob as they watched another group of government officials touring the cultural center. "When our love was our own secret rather than a national demonstration project," Jacob understood her ambivalence. The public validation of their choices had come at the cost of intimate privacy. Their marriage was no longer just about their personal happiness but about proving possibilities to skeptics who viewed their success as threatening to established racial hierarchies. "Do you regret the path we've taken?" he asked. "Never, but I sometimes wonder what our lives would have been like if we had been able to love each other without the world watching to see if we would succeed or fail." Ayana's honesty reflected the complex reality of their public prominence. The answer to her wondering came in the form of letters they received from couples throughout the territory and beyond. Mixed marriages that had once faced persecution were now finding acceptance by pointing to the Thunder Ridge example. Communities that had once insisted on cultural separation were experimenting with integration programs based on their model. "Our love has become larger than ourselves," Jacob realized as he read yet another letter from a couple seeking advice about navigating cultural differences. "What began as our personal arrangement has created possibilities for thousands of other people." The responsibility felt both humbling and inspiring. Their choice to love across cultural boundaries had opened doors for others who faced similar challenges. Their success had rewritten assumptions about what was possible when different peoples chose cooperation over conflict. 5 years after the tribal return, Thunder Ridge hosted the first interterritorial conference on cultural preservation and integration. Representatives from throughout the Western Territories came to study their methods and consider adopting similar approaches. In their own regions, Ayanna delivered the opening address to an audience that included territorial governors, tribal leaders, federal officials, and academic researchers. Her words carried the authority of someone who had lived the transformation she was describing. Cultural preservation is not about maintaining museums of the past, she told the assembled delegates. It is about ensuring that traditional wisdom continues to grow and adapt while retaining its essential values. Integration succeeds when it honors difference rather than erasing it. The conference concluded with the adoption of the Thunder Ridge Principles, a framework for cultural integration that emphasized voluntary participation, mutual respect, economic opportunity, and legal protection for traditional practices. These principles became the foundation for federal policy throughout the territorial system. Jacob and Ayanna's marriage had become the cornerstone of a new approach to cultural relations, but their personal happiness remained grounded in the simple daily choices they made to honor and support each other. The grand political implications of their love never overshadowed the intimate reality of two people who had chosen to build a life together. On quiet evenings, when the last visitors had departed and the cultural center had closed for the day, they would sit on their porch and remember the fear and uncertainty that had brought them together. The contrast between their early desperation and current contentment reminded them that love's greatest victories often begin with seemingly impossible circumstances. "I think about that first evening at Willow Creek," Ayanna said during one such quiet moment. "How terrified I was that you would reject me, how desperate I was to find any way to remain connected to this land. I think about standing on the train platform, planning to send you back without even meeting you," Jacob replied. "How my prejudices almost cost me the greatest happiness I've ever known." Their reflections were interrupted by the sound of children's laughter from the nearby settlement where Thomas Mitchell and Mary Strongheart had built their home. The young couple's own children were playing with neighbor children of various cultural backgrounds, their games incorporating elements from multiple traditions without conscious effort. "Look what we made possible," Ayanna said softly, watching the children create their own version of integration through play. The next generation was growing up, bilingual and bicultural, by choice rather than necessity, comfortable in multiple worlds without feeling displaced from any. They were learning that difference could be celebrated rather than merely tolerated, that cultural identity could be maintained without requiring separation from other communities. As the summer evening deepened into night, Jacob and Ayanna prepared to enter their house for the last time as the symbolic couple, whose marriage had launched a transformation of federal Indian policy. Tomorrow, Secretary Schertz would arrive to announce that the Thunder Ridge model had been adopted as official federal policy for all territorial integration programs. "We did something that will outlast us," Jacob observed as they stood in their doorway. "We did something that will continue through us," Ayanna corrected. "Every couple who chooses love over fear, every community that chooses cooperation over conflict, every policy that chooses respect over domination, they all carry forward what we started here." The mountain wind carried the scent of sage and pine, the sound of multiple languages being spoken in comfortable harmony, the evidence of a community that had proven integration could strengthen rather than weaken cultural identity. Their love story had become a foundational narrative for a new kind of American community, one that honored diversity while building unity. As they closed their door on another day in their transformed valley, Jacob and Ayanna carried with them the satisfaction of knowing that their practical arrangement had grown into something far beyond their original intentions. They had saved sacred sites, preserved traditional knowledge, influenced federal policy, and created a model for cultural cooperation that would guide future generations. But most importantly, they had found in each other the love that made all other achievements meaningful. Their marriage remained the foundation from which all their public success had grown. The the private happiness that sustained them through public pressures, the personal choice that had created possibilities they could never have imagined when they first agreed to face an uncertain future together. The Thunder Ridge Valley slept peacefully under starlight that had witnessed the transformation of a community and the validation of love that dared to bridge any distance between different hearts, seeking common ground. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.